because it's always a pleasure to interact with investors in the US. And these days, since I do get an opportunity at least twice to be here for the bank and the fund meetings, I've almost made it a part of a regular routine to interact with the investors itself. I remember when I first came here, the whole idea in the year 2014, the questions we were being asked were, will you be able to hike up the FDI limits in the insurance sector? And that seemed to be the key center stage issue. 3 years later, or 3.5 years later, I think one fact which stands conclusively established is India is now capable of taking big decisions and implementing them at a very large level itself. And therefore, when we speak in terms of the investment potential in India and what the Indian markets really have to open, and compared with even other competing economies which attract investment in the world, if you look at the size and the magnitude at which those decisions have been taken, in otherwise a world which was not a very fast-growing world in the last 3 years. Take a sector where we still have a long way to go. Infrastructure. As I speak to you today, we have 250 highways under construction. And therefore, at any given point of time, a sector which had conventionally slowed down about 3 to 4 years ago, this fact alone will indicate the magnitude of the activity which we have really undertaken as far as the infrastructure space is concerned. We've become power surplus. We are continuously bringing in private sector in a major way, expanding our port capacities. One area where we have a very large network, but which had not been modernized, the Indian Railways. Today, in several areas of Indian Railways, we are now trying for the first time to bring in a lot of private sector investment, whether it's the rolling stock, or it's the locomotives, or it's the new development of the railway stations itself. This provides a huge opportunity. And in the pipeline, we have almost 400 railway stations to be redone up. The first few of them, really the contracts have been awarded. The airports, and now the new initiative which we've taken, let alone modernizing the old metropolitan airports in India, and even the airports of the tier 2, tier 3 cities. These days the program is on for regional connectivity of smaller towns. And therefore you will have a very large potential both in the aviation sector and the airport construction sector itself being opened up for private participation itself. A second area which we normally never used to historically refer to at a large extent, particularly because that's an area where the level of economic growth was much less. And that's one of the areas of the future. And I keep repeatedly emphasizing it, the Prime Minister does it regularly, as to what is going to be the plight of those Indian villages. Because rural India is still way behind, and that's a part of the inequality that exists in India itself. So we currently have a program which is on, where each of the 600,000 odd villages by next year, 2019 beginning, is going to be connected by a regular road. Rural infrastructure in India historically was very poor. That's the massive scale at which the activity has been going on. The rural sanitation program and rural housing by and large was deprived of sanitation. And in the last 3 to 4 years, sanitation has become a center stage issue in India. And therefore, whether it's the corporate social responsibility funds of Indian corporates or it's a large funding from the government of India, the state governments, all going to for the establishment of sanitation facilities in Indian houses in the villages at governmental support. Electrification of each village probably would be completed by the end of this year or early 2018. And we've already announced the next step, that even in all the electrified villages, now today all but about 3,000 odd villages are electrified. And once each village is electrified, then you have to spot each home which is deprived of electricity and then target each home and make sure that each home has an electricity connection to it. And therefore, it's not only a few urban centers where the growth itself lies, but this is where eventually in the long run the growth potential of India really has to pick up. When I mentioned in the opening comments the earlier challenge which were being faced for the last 4-5 years, that raising from 26% to 49% the FDI and in the insurance sector itself was blocked, that looks like now a drop in the ocean. We've now seen a huge opening out, almost a near global integration as far as Indian economy is concerned. And at a time when major economies world over have been debating and moving towards protectionism, if there's one country in the world where you will find that this debate doesn't exist today, that's India. Even when we were opening out in 1991, we were apprehensive. But having enjoyed the fruits of that investment getting into India, this is now being universally regarded as an additionality of investment into India. And therefore, we've been able to invite a lot of and attract a lot of foreign direct investment almost in every sector. Now, sectors which were historically considered to be very sacrosanct as far as foreign direct investment was concerned, areas such as defense, etc., I think we've been able to convince the Indian public opinion that rather than just rely on equipment manufactured outside the country, it would be better that we invite those who are in possession of that technology to come partner with Indian players and set up the defense industry in India. And suddenly we find a spurt of joint ventures between large Indian corporates and international majors being now being undertaken for the purposes of defense investment as far as India is concerned. Now, when I speak in terms of FDI, it's not merely the fact that we've opened up. We've simplified our procedures. Virtually 95% of all investment that comes into India comes by the automatic route. And this year in the 2017 budget, I went ahead and announced that we didn't even need a foreign investment promotion board, because that itself means several months, if not years, of delay in processing each proposal which comes. I think since the procedures are clearly defined, let the respective ministries consider those 5% cases. The 95% of them almost come by the automatic route. And therefore, for foreign direct investment to get into India, India becomes one of the easiest places. It was mentioned by Chandrajit Banerjee in his opening comments with regard to the ease of doing business in India. We've consciously started now having rankings of each one of our states because permissions in New Delhi are reasonably easier. Whether it was the investment proposals or it's the environmental clearances, they normally come quite easily as far as Delhi is concerned. There is still some delay involved as far as land and construction facilities are concerned, as far as the states are concerned. And therefore, we've started ranking each one of the states. And this has given rise to a concept of what is called now competitive federalism in India. Each state in India now is vying for investments. Each one competitively is holding its own investors' meets and therefore wants investors to be presented with a package as to why it's a better destination than its neighboring states. And that's an environment which we've long wanted to create, and I'm quite certain that we've been moving in that direction. Of course, in most developing economies as they grow, and it's been seen across the world, historically it's been true, the stigma of corruption gets attached to them. How does one get rid of this menace? And I think governments in India in the past also have faced similar challenges. And we realized after analyzing the reasons that merely having accountability mechanisms in place within the system is not going to do away with any form of political corruption or corruption in decision making. What was needed was to replace the system wherein instead of decisions being taken based on discretions of individuals, it would be the systems that would prevail. And most of the systems, whether it's awarding contracts, awarding resources, had to be driven by a market mechanism. And therefore, the market mechanism had to ensure that the interaction between the government, the physical interface between the government and a possible investor doesn't exist. He just sits at home and he just makes his bid, and if he's the best bid, he walks away with the contract. And this really has enabled India now to put that image of decisions being taken for improper motives actually behind this. We've been in the field of direct taxation, been trying to implement this. And today, I can tell you that over 99% of all tax returns filed in India are online. The queries addressed to companies are online, to individuals are online. And about 70 to 80% of the refunds that they get them back within a fortnight or so online, or the communication goes online followed by their payment. And the eventual idea is that use technology as far as revenue is concerned, because revenue departments are one which can bring a bad image to any government and therefore add to the discomfort of doing business itself. We're consciously realizing it. Then it comes to the big ideas which are far more difficult to implement. It was mentioned when we took over, India was 4 years ago a society which was least connected in terms to the banking system itself. And therefore, we undertook this big idea of financial inclusion. And our colleagues who look after it and observe this field closely can't find a parallel example in history anywhere in the world where you almost had 300 million people in a matter of few months being visited by bank officials or bank representatives and their bank accounts being opened up even if they had a zero balance in it. So every poor tribal in India living in a remote tribal area or living on a mountaintop had his bank account opened. Once this financial inclusion was undertaken, at that time, a lot of people balked at it. What's the point in opening bank accounts of people when 78% of them don't have a single rupee in that bank? Cynicism is a part of Indian life. And therefore, we are quite used to comments of this kind. And that actually did happen. And once these accounts were opened, came the next big idea. How do you put monies in these bank accounts? Now, the government of India and the governments of several states in India give innumerable support systems, and these support systems remain untargeted. That's the inherent nature of generalized subsidies, which I've always described as an unquantified amount, which is always given to an unidentified section of people. And therefore, all of us from India sitting on this dais were also enjoying a very large number of subsidies. We all bought our petrol at a subsidized price, which the government was subsidizing. Our homes got cooking gas at a subsidized price, something which none of us was entitled to. And that is the character of unstructured subsidies. The only time it used to be discussed was on the budget day in the evening. Every economist would say, you must target subsidies, and then for the last 30 years, nothing had been done. Now, the unique identity number, which was an idea which, in fact, the previous government had started, but it couldn't legislate, and it couldn't give full flow to that idea. We brought in a legislation, and the purpose of this was that dissipation of all government benefits must now take place directly into the bank accounts by way of a cash transfer. You buy products and commodities at market price, but there is a cash support system which reaches your bank accounts. So today you have millions of farm labor who are given rural employment, where salaries reach their bank accounts. You have millions of people who are entitled to a subsidy in cooking gas. All the wealthy people have been excluded. The subsidy reaches their bank account. The widow pensions, the scholarship for the poor children. So every kind of state support, and there are dozens of them, which now reach directly the bank accounts of those people. And an overwhelming large number of those zero bank accounts have actually become functional. Each one of the holders also got a debit card, so which he was entitled to use, get into the digital space itself. And the next reform, how do we support the, how do we incentivize these? So low-cost insurance policies was offered to those who had these bank accounts. So you suddenly had millions of insurance policies being opened for them. And then we undertook a microfinance scheme on behalf of the banking system, where almost 73% of the recipients are women, and who would start on basis of small loans given by them. And there are no NPAs on those loans. They've been very diligent in paying them back and servicing those loans, and therefore generate employment for themselves and maybe for an attendant or two with them by setting up some small business or effective work under the Mudra scheme, as we called it. Now, when this was also a conscious effort to integrate the informal economy into the more formal one. And one of the hurdles in this entire informal economy was that India loved cash. India loved to deal, as many developing countries do, deal essentially in cash. And therefore, you would have cash operating in the system, and this cash which operated in the system had a certain amount of anonymity about it, and therefore all the challenges that a cash economy throws up were available with us. No government in the past, and I underline that, no government in the past actually had the courage to make it a part of its political and economic agenda. You had almost 12.5% of your GDP in terms of cash currency. 86% of this currency was high denominational currency. And all the curses which are attached to the cash itself. It leads to evasion, it leads to crime, it leads to support of various insurgent activities in India, was available with that. And therefore, a conscious decision, that I'm not going into all the steps which we took against the shadow or the black money economy that operated in India, which has also had its impact in squeezing the cash itself, of demonetizing that currency. the object really was this anonymity which is attached to the cash. Can this end? And therefore, everybody was compelled to deposit his money in the bank account. Once it is deposited, there are a few objects of the whole exercise. Will the tax base increase thereafter? An immediate impact has been that the number of personal income tax pays, the number of corporate income tax pays won't increase, because the corporates were in any case dealing not in cash, they were a part of the formal economy. The number of individual taxpayers substantially jumped up. The second object was, will the digital transactions increase? From 700 million, they immediately went up to 1400 billion. Currently are anywhere between 13 to 1400 billion, and will continue to grow. Will the amount of currency itself squeeze? In the first round, it has squeezed by a significant percentage. And the amount of cash currency available, the amount of high denominational currency has squeezed, and probably will continue to squeeze. And that squeeze will further aid and assist the digitization itself. And for the first time, the operation of that shadow economy itself has become a part of the center stage itself. The next stage was, the direct tax rules are today addressing how do you spend that money. So there are a large number of restrictions on cash expenditure in India today, causing some upheaval, but people get used to it. The second, how do they generate this cash? How do you make that difficult? And therefore, then came the next big idea, that all these multiple taxes and cesses between the central and the state governments, consolidate them into one. An idea which has been worked for a long time, and then we were able to pass and implement from the 1st of July, 3 months ago, the goods and services tax. So the entire chain of an economic transaction in the life of a product or a service now goes online. So from the moment the raw material is purchased, from the manufacturing taking place, from the value additions taking place, to the sales taking place, to the inter-sales sales taking place, all taxes are replicated and repeated by one tax. Now, it's early days, but a pattern really has come up. And therefore, there is a lot of scope for continuously watching it and making changes. And that's why we've been able to establish, I think, to a great satisfaction, in the GST Council, India's first genuine federal institution, which meets every month, which reviews the monthly situation, which takes the decisions, which reviews the rates. There'll be a lot of compression and changes of rates which will take place in the times to come itself. But to start off, it's been a fairly smooth transition. We felt that the refunds of the exporters were being held back for a long time, and therefore we've started an alternate mechanism immediately to give them relief. The compliance burden on the small sector is being brought down. We are now, under the GST, giving highly attractive schemes in order to ensure that the non-compliant in India become compliant. For instance, in the direct taxes, we are probably the only country in the world where we've started a special entry point taxation rate of 5%. So the lowest slab in India is 5%. The 5% slab doesn't exist anywhere in the world. That is because of the non-compliant tax character of Indian society. You make it easy for people to enter the taxation net. You are able to expand. In the goods and services tax, for traders up to a 10 million rupee turnover, that's a 1 crore turnover, we now have a scheme for them. If you are in the manufacturing space, you just pay 2% of your turnover. And if you are in the trading space, you pay 1% of your turnover, and that's your annual tax. So at 1% and 2% GST, we are trying to bring them into the tax net because the first 2 months data has shown that almost 95% of the tax is just being paid by 400,000 assessees. And therefore, it's very top heavy in terms of payment, and there's a need as far as India to continue to expand the tax base at the bottom itself. And therefore, once this whole net itself gets completed, from financial inclusion to the demonetization, to the steps against the shadow economy, to the goods and services tax, to the direct tax incentive, each one of this falls into place where brick by brick you lay down the structure in order to integrate an informal economy into a much larger formal economy. Now, incremental changes always takes place, but this works out to a particular pattern. And I think today India has acquired the capacity and ability to get into, to perceive these big ideas and to be able to implement these big ideas. Of course, these big ideas can, in the transition stages, throw up challenges. For instance, once we announced that on the 1st of July, the goods and services tax will come, the manufacturing went down for some time for the reason that people were wanting to get rid of their existing stocks so that they have newer manufacturing takes place when the new tax structure comes into place. So there will be some transient impacts which will take place. But those transient impacts really don't affect the long-term roadmap which we've acquired. And I think amongst emerging economies, India today has a potential for not only being a large, we were always a very large market, but being a much cleaner economy, a much bigger economy, which is now capable of taking and implementing these big ideas further.